said it was impossible the wild black stallion in the corner pen had broken every man who tried. The ranch owners smirked before the whole crowd and jeered, "If you can even touch that beast boy, this ranch is yours." The people laughed. The poor cowboy had nothing, no money, no name, no chance. But when he stepped into the dust and met the stallion's blazing eyes, something happened that silenced the laughter and left the mighty rancher staring in disbelief. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The summer rodeo had always been the biggest event in Dust Valley. For most of the year, the town was quiet, a scattering of wooden storefronts, a single saloon with faded paint, and streets that were more dust than stone. But every summer, for 3 days, the world seemed to pour itself into this forgotten place. On this Saturday afternoon, the rodeo grounds were packed to the brim. The wooden bleachers groaned under the weight of families, ranchers, and traveling traders who had come from miles around. Banners snapped in the warm wind, painted red and blue with the words, "Dust Valley Summer Rodeo." Country music drifted from a brass band set up near the entrance. The twang of fiddles and guitars carried over the crowd's laughter and the distant clang of cowbells. The smell was thick and familiar, sun-baked hay, horse sweat leather, and the tang of fried food from a vendor's cart. Children raced between legs, their laughter piercing through the murmur of voices. Men slapped each other's backs, placing bets on which bronc would throw its rider first. Women fanned themselves against the heat, their dresses splattered with dust. It was the heartbeat of the town, and everyone wanted a place to witness it. At the center of the noise and color stood a man who seemed larger than the rodeo itself. Mr. Grayson, master of Dust Valley Ranch, emerged from behind the railings with a gait that announced he owned everything his eyes touched. His outfit alone was enough to make heads turn. A tailored western vest of deep maroon silk boots, polished until they reflected the sun, and a hat as white and spotless as the clouds above. Around him clustered his men, loyal not out of love, but out of fear of losing their pay. Among them was Eduardo, a stocky fellow with a face hardened by years of carrying out orders without question. They walked 2 steps behind, like shadows clinging to power. Grayson's laughter rose above the music, sharp and cutting. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known hunger, who believed money could break horses and men alike. Dust Valley Ranch stretched for miles under his name, and everyone in town owed him either wages, debt, or grudges. Today his presence was not just a spectacle, but a reminder he was the wealthiest, the strongest, the untouchable ruler of Dust Valley. On the far edge of the bleachers, almost hidden in the shadows of the last row, sat Ethan Cole. His clothes marked him at once, a faded checkered shirt worn at the elbows, jeans, with patches boots whose leather had long lost its shine. His hat was bent out of shape, the sweatband dark with years of labor under the sun. He did not look like the kind of man one noticed in a crowd. He worked season to season, moving from ranch to ranch, breaking calves, mending fences, earning just enough to keep himself fed and his horse shod. His name was whispered sometimes with pity, sometimes with dismissal, a hard worker, but just a drifter. Behind him, 2 old ranch hands chuckled quietly. "That one, he ain't got more than a dime to his name," one muttered. "Good hand with cattle, sure," the other replied. But thinking he could stand against a man like Grayson, that's just foolish talk. Ethan heard, but he didn't turn. His gaze was steady brown eyes, fixed on the arena, as if he were studying something no one else saw. There was nothing restless in his face, only a calmness that seemed out of place amid the noise and revelry. Not far from the main ring stood a smaller enclosure, its wooden bars reinforced with iron. Inside, pacing like a storm that refused to break, was Midnight. The stallion was a sight both terrible and magnificent, tall as a wall coat, as black as coal eyes burning with a reddish glint under the sun. His mane flew wild with each shake of his head, strands whipping like banners. He struck the gate with his hooves, iron shoes clanging against metal, each blow sending shivers down the posts. The crowd kept a careful distance. Everyone in Dust Valley knew the stories. Men had tried to mount Midnight before strong men, proud riders, but none had lasted more than a breath. Some had been carried out with broken bones. Others had limped away and sworn never to ride again. The horse was not just wild, he was vindictive. They said he remembered faces, held grudges, and would sooner kill than be mastered. Children pressed against the rails, eyes wide, as parents tugged them back with sharp warnings. Midnight was no rodeo showpiece. He was a challenge too dangerous to be touched. The band struck up a louder tune as Mr. Grayson stepped into the center of the arena. His voice boomed, carried by pride and whiskey. "Ladies and gentlemen of Dust Valley," he shouted, spreading his arms. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the strength of the cowboy spirit and the pride of our ranches, and the glory of the rodeo." Applause roared across the stands. But he was not done. Grayson turned slowly, and his fingers stretched out like a spear aimed straight at the dark figure in the back row. "You there, Ethan Cole." The crowd shifted heads, turning until they found the quiet cowboy rising slightly in surprise. Grayson's grin spread wide. "You call yourself a cowboy. You claim to live by the saddle and the lasso. Then let's see it. Let's see if you can even touch that beast." He jabbed his thumb toward the stallion's enclosure, where Midnight reared and slammed against the bars. "If you can lay your hand on him," Grayson declared, voice dripping with mockery, "I'll give you Dust Valley Ranch itself for a heartbeat." There was silence. Then the crowd exploded with laughter. The idea was absurd, too wild, even for rodeo theatrics. Men clapped each other on the shoulders, women shook their heads, and children shouted encouragement, as if daring Ethan into suicide. Groups reacted differently. A circle of young boys whistled and jeered, "Go on, Cole. Show us you ain't scared." The older cowboys exchanged grim looks, shaking their heads. "No man in his right mind would step into that pen," one muttered. Near the judges' stand, Hank Miller, the ranch's longtime foreman, stood with arms folded. His weathered face betrayed little, but his eyes were sharp, following Ethan closely. He had known the boy once years ago when Ethan had worked briefly under him. There was something in the silence, something worth watching. From the shaded box seats, Clara Grayson, the rancher's wife, pressed her lips together. She did not speak against her husband. She never did in public, but her eyes betrayed disapproval. And beside her, Abigail Grayson leaned forward, her young face alight with curiosity. Unlike the rest, she did not laugh. She studied Ethan as if she saw in him something no one else recognized. All eyes turned to the back row where Ethan remained seated. The laughter swelled, urging him to protest, to shake his head and walk away. Instead, Ethan rose. He did not argue, did not shout back at the wealthy rancher who mocked him. He walked down the steps of the bleachers with the steady rhythm of boots that had crossed 1,000 miles of prairie. The crowd parted reluctantly as he stepped into the ring dust swirling around his worn jeans. He removed his hat, ran a calloused hand over his brow, and let out a slow breath. His gaze lifted toward the iron bars that barely held Midnight back. The stallion's roar split the air, a scream of defiance that rattled the rails. Laughter rolled louder from the stands. But Ethan didn't flinch. He slid the hat back onto his head and set his jaw. The sunlight caught his eyes, and for the first time, the crowd noticed what lay in them. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't madness. It was resolve, the kind forged from hardship, sharpened by hunger, tested by years of quiet endurance. The loudspeaker crackled above the roar of the crowd. "Step forward, Ethan Cole. Time to prove yourself." The announcer's voice cut through the late afternoon heat, and all eyes turned toward the young cowboy who now stood near the edge of the arena. The laughter from earlier had quieted into something sharper, half curiosity, half hunger for disaster. People leaned forward in their seats, fanning themselves with hats, craning their necks to catch the moment. Hank Miller leaned slightly toward Clara Grayson in the shaded box seats. His voice was low but certain. "He's not crazy," Hank murmured. "There's something in that boy's eyes, something none of us understands yet." Clara's gaze never left Ethan as she whispered back, "Either he's a fool, or he knows something my husband never cared to learn." The hum of anticipation thickened. 100 conversations hushed to silence as Ethan began his slow walk toward the stallion's pen. The gate creaked open with a long, rusty groan. Dust rose in a golden cloud, glittering under the sunlight. Ethan stepped across the threshold with nothing in his hands, no whip, no rope, no lariat slung over his shoulder. Only the sweat-darkened brim of his hat and the calluses on his bare hands accompanied him. A ripple of disbelief swept through the crowd. "Is he out of his mind?" someone hissed. "He's walking in there with nothing," another spat. "Suicide," muttered a weathered rancher in the back. Midnight exploded into motion, ears flat hooves pounding against the dirt like thunder. His nostrils flared wide breath, shooting from him in bursts that stirred the dust at Ethan's feet. The stallion's eyes burned red with fury, and his scream tore through the air, rattling spines all across the stands. For a moment, the contrast was almost surreal. The poor cowboy in faded denim and worn leather, walking calmly toward the very embodiment of chaos. Every step Ethan took was deliberate, measured, unhurried, as though he were walking to greet an old friend rather than an animal sworn to break men. A few women gasped and covered their eyes. A child squealed, half in terror, half in delight, while his father pulled him close. 10 seconds, an old cowboy muttered grimly, "That's all he'll last before that devil puts him in the dirt." Another nodded in agreement, his jaw tight. "He'll be lucky to walk away alive." On the stands above, Mr. Grayson folded his arms, a smug smile curling his lips. "This'll be the best free show Dust Valley's ever had," he said to no one in particular. The men around him chuckled, though their laughter carried an edge of unease. But not everyone was laughing. Abigail Grayson leaned forward, her knuckles white where they gripped the railing. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes locked on Ethan as though willing him strength. She didn't know why, but something in her refused to look away. Inside the pen, Ethan stopped. He was only a few yards from midnight now. Close enough to smell the wild heat of the horse's sweat, close enough to hear the iron shoes biting into the ground. And yet, he didn't move forward. He planted his boots firmly in the dirt and stayed still. His chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths. His eyes fixed on Midnight's, not with challenge, not with fear, but with a calm so alien that it puzzled the stallion. Midnight circled, throwing his head high, the whites of his eyes flashing. He screamed again and spun around Ethan hooves, carving into the dust. Every muscle in the crowd seemed to tighten. Surely the horse would lunge and trample him to pieces. But Ethan only turned slowly, pivoting on his heels to follow the stallion's arc, never letting him slip out of sight, never breaking the strange thread of presence he offered. Silence fell over the bleachers. The music had stopped. The announcer's voice was gone. There was only the ring of hooves and the faint rustle of flags above. And in that silence, Ethan saw it. Midnight's movements fierce as they were carried a flaw. Each time the stallion swung left, his stride faltered. His left shoulder dipped the muscles along his flank, shuddered as if catching pain. The limp was slight, almost invisible to an untrained eye. But Ethan had lived among horses all his life. He had patched their hides, rubbed down their legs, and watched them stumble when pride demanded they pretend they weren't hurt. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the left side of the stallion's body. A twitch, a wince that no one else noticed. This isn't just rage, Ethan thought. It's pain. Memories flickered across his mind. Horses he'd seen ruined by careless rider scars that told stories of whips and spurs, animals driven past their breaking point for pride and profit. Midnight wasn't only wild, he was wounded, and that wound had turned into fury. To the crowd, he was a monster. To Grayson, he was an untamable beast. But to Ethan in that moment, Midnight was something else, entirely a creature betrayed by men, and left to carry scars he couldn't escape. Then Ethan did something no one expected. He stepped back. Not forward, not closer, but back 3 paces, boots scuffing the dust, his hands open and visible. Gasps swept through the stands. To most, it looked like surrender. To Grayson, it looked like humiliation. But Hank Miller's eyes sharpened, and for the first time all afternoon, his lips curled into the faintest smile. He spoke under his breath, though Clara caught the words. "No," he said softly. "He's not retreating. He's inviting." Midnight froze. His massive chest heaved as he stared at the cowboy who had broken the script. Every man who had entered this pen had charged at him with rope or spur. None had yielded. None had stepped back. The stallion stamped once, twice, his ears twitching with confusion. Dust hung in the air between them, waiting. Ethan lowered his head slightly, not in fear, but in respect. His body spoke what his voice did not. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to understand you." For the briefest heartbeat, something shifted. Midnight did not charge. He did not strike. He simply stood, eyes burning, caught in the puzzle of this man who chose stillness over conquest. And in that strange, suspended silence, the rodeo crowd who had come to witness a spectacle of blood and dust felt the first ripple of something else entirely. Not defeat, not madness, but the faint, trembling outline of trust. The crowd erupted the moment Ethan stepped back from the stallion. What had felt like a rare silence just minutes earlier now collapsed into noise boos, whistles, and laughter crashing down like a storm. Mr. Grayson wasted no time. He clapped his hands 3 sharp times, the sound echoing over the bleachers. His voice cut through the jeers, every word sharp as a whip. "Couldn't even touch it," he sneered. "And you think you'll ever ride it? Don't make me laugh. You're nothing but a cheap cowboy. Dust Valley Ranch isn't a playground for beggars like you." The laughter swelled again, fueled by the weight of his words. Grayson's hired men cackled loudest of all their voices, carrying above the din as if eager to please their master. Even some townsfolk joined in, swept along by the cruelty of the moment. Ethan stood in the center of it, still and unflinching. Every insult struck like a lash across his back, every roar of derision a test of his pride. He could feel the sting, his dignity bruised in front of the people he'd worked beside all his life. But he didn't let it show. On the stands, Abigail turned her head away, unwilling to watch her father grind another man into dust. Shame pressed against her chest. Shame for the cruelty paraded as entertainment, shame for the father she no longer recognized. Ethan did not answer. He didn't spit back an insult, didn't raise his voice to defend himself. Instead, he reached for his hat, brushed the sweat from his brow, and placed it firmly back on his head. His eyes didn't linger on Grayson, nor on the jeering faces in the crowd. They settled instead on Midnight. The stallion still paced restlessly inside the pen, snorting, pawing the dirt. To most, he was a beast unbroken. To Ethan, he was a puzzle waiting for patience. His silence infuriated Grayson more than any curse could have. The rancher wanted victory, wanted Ethan's humiliation complete. But the young man's calm denied him that satisfaction. Whispers stirred through the audience. "Too stubborn to quit," one voice muttered. "Or too poor to walk away," another said. "But poverty doesn't win you a ranch," someone else scoffed. Still, a few gazes lingered on Ethan with something more complicated. Wonder if perhaps silence meant strength. A figure broke from the sidelines. Hank Miller, Dust Valley's longtime manager, his hair gone white, his frame wiry but unbent, walked into the arena. His boots scuffed the dirt as he approached, and the crowd quieted almost instinctively. Hank had trained half the cowboys in this valley, taught them the art of breaking horses, and every scar on his weathered hands told a story. He lit a cigarette, inhaled, then let his raspy voice roll out across the stands. "No man touches Midnight in a day," Hank said. His words were steady, carrying weight far beyond their volume. "But that boy," he gestured to Ethan, "he saw something none of you ever bothered to see. Not with ropes, not with spurs, not with whips. He saw what that horse is hiding. Give him time." Murmurs rippled through the bleachers. Hank Miller was respected in Dust Valley, even by those who feared Grayson's wealth. His reputation for fairness was ironclad. When Hank spoke, people listened. Grayson's expression curdled. His lips twisted as he snapped, "So you take his side, old man. Don't forget who pays your wages." Hank took another drag, then flicked the ash to the dirt. His eyes narrowed, calm but defiant. "I don't take sides," he said. "I take truth. And I know what I saw in that boy's eyes. The eyes of a cowboy who recognizes pain in a horse, not just rage. If you can't see that, maybe you've forgotten what horsemanship is." The crowd fell into a hush. Grayson's jaw tightened, but he couldn't match the authority of Hank's words. In the shaded box above, Clara, Grayson watched quietly. She had been silent most of her life, in her husband's shadow content, to let him boast and bark orders. But now, watching Ethan, she saw something different. Not bravado, not cruelty, not the need to dominate. There was a gentleness in his gaze, a patience she had never once seen in her husband's dealings with animals or with people. Her voice was almost a whisper, meant only for herself. Perhaps Dust Valley needs someone like him. She didn't speak louder. She didn't challenge her husband publicly. But her silence carried weight, an unspoken acknowledgement of where her sympathies lay. Grayson, unwilling to be outdone, straightened and forced a smile, though anger flickered in his eyes. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping disdain. "If you want to make this a spectacle, let's make it worth something." He strode forward, lifting his voice for all to hear. 14 days, he declared. "That's what you get, cowboy. 2 weeks to ride that devil in front of the whole town. If you succeed, Dust Valley Ranch will split, half will be yours. But," he let the word hang, savoring the weight of it. His eyes hardened, his voice low and cold. "If you fail, you leave this town forever. No more work, no more second chances. Dust Valley will not tolerate a fool's pride." The gasp from the bleachers rolled like a wave. Half the ranch for a drifter, it was madness, and yet the risk was worse. One slip and Ethan would lose not only his dream, but his home. The stakes had transformed from humiliation into destiny. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He stood beneath the blazing sun, the dust clinging to his boots, the echoes of Grayson's ultimatum pulsing in the air. Then he lifted his chin, his voice steady. "I accept. No hesitation, no bargaining. Just a simple truth spoken aloud." The crowd erupted. Some cheered the gamble, eager for drama. Others laughed, certain of Ethan's doom. But no one could look away now. The air vibrated with tension as people poured their opinions into the heat of the evening. 14 days, he won't last 3. A ranch hand scoffed, shaking his head. Boy's already dead, just doesn't know it yet. But others whispered differently. "He saw something in that horse," a woman murmured. "Didn't you notice?" The way he stepped back, maybe another man replied slowly. "Maybe he knows what he's doing." The community was divided, the rodeo now transformed into a bet for the soul of Dust Valley. Hank walked over to Ethan, laid a heavy calloused hand on his shoulder, and leaned close. "Don't listen to them," he said quietly. "Don't even listen to me. Listen to the horse. It'll tell you what it needs, if you're willing to hear it." Ethan nodded once. Abigail's eyes found his across the arena. There was fear there, fear of what would happen if he failed, but also something else. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this cowboy no one believed in might change everything. The night after Ethan accepted the challenge, the rodeo grounds emptied out, leaving only a few lanterns flickering along the fences. Dust hung low in the air, stirred by the last of the departing wagons. For most in Dust Valley, the spectacle was over until the boy inevitably failed. But for Ethan, it was just beginning. He did not return to the ramshackle shack he'd rented at the edge of town. Instead, with borrowed nails, cast-off planks, and a weathered tarp, he set about building a makeshift shelter right beside Midnight's pen. It wasn't much a frame of timber, a patchwork roof against rain, a small fire pit for cooking beans and coffee. But it was close. Close enough that the stallion could hear his movements, at night smell the smoke of his fire, feel the quiet rhythm of his presence. By dawn, the townsfolk noticed. "He's gone crazy," a ranch hand muttered as he rode by. "Who in their right mind camps next to that devil horse?" Another shook his head, spitting into the dust. "Boy's signing his death warrant." You can't tame fury by sleeping beside it. But Ethan wasn't thinking about taming, not yet. He thought only of closeness. Horses, like men he believed, needed time to grow accustomed to a presence. If Midnight was to ever trust him, it had to start with the smallest thing, the sound of his breathing, through the dark. In the days that followed, Ethan did not push. He spent hours each afternoon sitting on a stool outside the rail fence, elbows resting on his knees, eyes following Midnight's every movement. He noted the way the stallion tore at his hay, impatient, then suddenly pausing to stare into the distance. He memorized when Midnight pawed at the ground, when he snorted as if warning unseen ghosts away, when he stilled at the sound of a hawk overhead. The pattern that struck Ethan most was the horse's left side. Each time Midnight pivoted, his left shoulder dipped a subtle hitch in his stride. Sometimes, a tremor ran through the muscle, as though pain flared from an old wound. Ethan's hunch from the first encounter deepened. This wasn't rage alone. This was suffering. He kept the pen clean, hauling in fresh water each morning, spreading new straw when the old turned damp. Never once did he bring a whip or a rope. He didn't force the stallion to move, didn't try to corner him. Instead, he worked as if in service, making sure Midnight had what he needed, asking for nothing in return. Bit by bit, the stallion grew accustomed to this silent caretaker. No charge at the fence, no teeth bared each time Ethan approached with a bucket. Only wary eyes always watching. One evening when the sunset painted the fields in blood-red light, a soft rustle broke Ethan's concentration. Abigail Grayson stood a few paces away, her dress catching the dying glow of the sun. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Her movements were cautious, as if fearful her father might appear at any moment. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I brought you something." Ethan stood brushing dust from his hands. "Miss Grayson," she handed him the bundle. Inside were 2 slim books, one on veterinary practices, another on the old traditions of horse whisperers' techniques, half forgotten by the ranches that had long replaced patience with force. "Don't let my father see," she said quickly. "But I thought you might find use for these." For a long moment, Ethan only stared at the books as if unsure they were real. "Why?" he asked at last. Abigail's gaze flicked toward Midnight, then back to Ethan. "Because I saw the way you looked at him. You're not doing this just for yourself." "Are you?" Ethan's answer was simple, his voice low but steady. "It's not about winning or losing. That horse deserves to be heard. Maybe for the first time in his life." Her eyes softened, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that defied the divisions her father had built. From that evening on, she returned often. Sometimes with bread, sometimes with a flask of coffee, sometimes with nothing but quiet words that made the long nights less lonely. When the dark settled over Dust Valley, Ethan reached for something older than books. From his pack, he drew a small wooden flute, worn smooth with age. It had been his mother's, a keepsake from years long gone, and though his hands were calloused from ranch work, they remembered the gentle placement of fingers along its holes. He lifted it to his lips and breathed. The first notes were rough, tumbling into the night air like half-forgotten prayers. Midnight reared startled by the unfamiliar sound, nostrils flaring, hooves striking sparks from the packed dirt. But Ethan kept playing, steady, unafraid. Night after night, he returned to the same spot, sitting cross-legged by the pen, the melody winding through the stillness. He played slow, patient tunes, soft echoes of lullabies his mother once sang, notes that rose like the wind across the prairie. Sometimes he sang too, in a voice rough and cracked from dust and long days, but warm in its imperfection. At first, Midnight fought its snorting, pacing, throwing his head. Yet the man never stopped, and little by little the stallion's fury shifted. His ears twitched toward the sound, his eyes once wild and rolling steadied. By the 6th night, he no longer bolted to the far end of the pen. Instead, he stood sides heaving, watching as the cowboy's song drifted into the stars. People noticed. "Music," one cowboy laughed at the saloon. "Next, he'll be reading it poetry." But another quieter said, "You didn't see it." The horse was listening. Soon children gathered at the edge of the field, sitting cross-legged in the grass as the flute sang under the moon. To them, it was magic, a story unfolding without words. Progress came on the 5th day. Ethan entered the pen carrying a pail of water. Midnight tensed, muscles bunching as if ready to strike. But this time, he didn't retreat to the far fence. He watched. He let Ethan set the bucket down without a violent lunge. Ethan didn't press his luck. He placed the water gently, then bowed his head slightly as if greeting an equal. The gesture was not lost on Midnight. The stallion flicked his ears confused, but remained still. Each day, Ethan lingered longer inside the pen. He let Midnight breathe in his scent, hear the steady rhythm of his footsteps, feel the lack of threat. Once Ethan raised his hand slowly, palm open, not touching, only showing. Midnight flinched, stepping back, but he didn't attack. That to Ethan was more than progress. It was a conversation beginning. From a distance, Hank Miller leaned on the fence pipe, clenched between his teeth. He nodded to himself. "That boy's teaching the whole damn valley something," he muttered. "That a horse doesn't just answer to rope and spur. It answers to a heart willing to wait." Not everyone agreed. In the saloons, rough laughter filled the air. "He's playing lullabies to a beast," a rancher scoffed. What's next? Tucking it in with a bedtime story. But more and more people drifted out to the pen at night, drawn by the sight of the dark stallion standing calm under the moon, ears perked toward the man with the flute. Children hushed each other, eyes wide as they listened. Women who once covered their eyes during the first encounter now lingered at the fences. From the veranda of the ranch house, Clara Grayson watched. Her hands clutched the railing, knuckles pale. She felt a tangle of emotions, fear that her husband's pride would turn violent, but also a fragile, dangerous hope. The wind came hard off the plains that night, tearing through Dust Valley with a restless howl. It rattled the shutters of the ranch house, sent tumbleweeds skittering across the yard, and made the lantern flames outside Ethan's shelter flicker wildly. Ethan had just stoked his small fire when he heard it, an explosive scream that cut through the storm like a blade. Midnight. He leapt to his feet and ran toward the pen. The stallion was thrashing violently, hooves pounding against the wooden rails, sweat darkening his coat until it gleamed silver under the moonlight. His mane stuck wet to his neck, and every breath came in ragged bursts of steam. Ethan froze a few feet from the fence hands, open at his sides. He didn't shout, didn't wave his arms, only stood still, letting the wild fury unfold before him. But his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, caught the detail others might have missed. Each time Midnight reared his left shoulder, twisted awkwardly, and when the moonlight spilled across the muscled curve of his chest, Ethan saw it, an old scar, thick and pale, running down from the crest of the shoulder toward the breast. Not rage, Ethan thought. Pain. The memories rushed back the way Midnight sometimes limped when circling the subtle flinch whenever he turned sharply left. The beast's defiance wasn't born of cruelty. It was born of a wound that had never been healed. His heart clenched. For the first time since arriving in Dust Valley, Ethan felt he was closer to understanding Midnight's story than anyone had ever dared. By dawn, his decision was made. He saddled up early, rode into town, and stopped at the small brick building with the faded sign, Collins Veterinary Practice. Dr. Richard Collins was an old man, with shoulders still broad despite his age, his beard a tangle of white. He looked up from the ledger as Ethan pushed through the door, dust clinging to his boots. "You Collins," said, frowning. "You're the fool trying to break that devil horse." Ethan dipped his head in a respectful nod. "Not break. Help." Collins barked a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Help, son, I wouldn't step within 20 yards of that brute. I like keeping all my bones where they belong." Ethan didn't flinch. "I'll be there with you. It won't harm you. Just look at the shoulder. That's all I ask." The older man studied him, narrowing his eyes. What he saw was not arrogance, but conviction, quiet, steady, immovable. At last, Collins sighed. "Damn fool's courage," he muttered. "But I'll come. Someone has to keep you alive long enough to pay your debts." Word spread faster than wildfire. By the time Collins gathered his kit, Abigail had already heard. She appeared outside the office with a satchel of her own clean bandages, jars of salve. "You'll need these," she said softly, handing the bag to Ethan. He met her eyes. Gratitude flickered there, though he said little. "Thank you." Her voice lowered. "Be careful. If Father learns I helped..." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Ethan gave her a single nod, a promise sealed without words. That afternoon, a small crowd gathered again by the pen. Dust Valley's folks loved a spectacle, and the thought of the old vet and the stubborn cowboy walking into the cage of a monster was too good to miss. Collins insisted on caution. "You go in first," he said, clutching the rail. "If he doesn't kill you, I'll take a look from here." Ethan slipped inside his flute, hanging from a cord at his side. Midnight's ears shot forward, body taut like a drawn bow. Ethan lifted the flute, played a few low notes, gentle calming. The stallion snorted, circled, but did not charge. Step by step, Ethan moved closer, always keeping his body angled, never square his voice, murmuring low, steady words. "Easy, boy. I'm not here to hurt you. Easy." At last, the moonlight and the lanterns combined to show the scar clearly. Collins leaned forward on the rail, his eyes narrowing. "It's no accident," he said grimly. "That horse was hurt bad. Rodeo fall, maybe. Or worse, somebody drove him into the ground and kept riding. Muscle torn, never stitched. It healed ugly, pulling at every step." Hank Miller, who had appeared quietly at the edge of the crowd, sucked on his pipe. His voice rasped like dry leather. And all this time, folks called it madness. Wasn't madness. It was agony. Abigail, standing close enough to hear, pressed a hand to her lips. Midnight hadn't been a demon by nature. He'd been a prisoner inside his own body. The revelation rippled through the onlookers. Murmurs replaced laughter. For the first time, pity edged into their voices. Healing became the new mission. Ethan sought Collins' guidance on how to ease the wound lineaments, for the muscle bandages to keep swelling down, gentle massage to restore movement. The first attempts were chaos. Each time Ethan reached for Midnight's shoulder, the stallion reared teeth, snapping hooves, lashing. The crowd jeered from outside the fence. "He's trying to pet it to death," one man scoffed. Another snorted. "Maybe he'll sing it a lullaby while he's at it." But Ethan didn't lash back. He waited. When the horse calmed, he tried again, first touching only the mane, then resting his palm briefly on the good shoulder. Then he'd step back, reward the calm with space. Day after day, he repeated the ritual. Each failure was met with patience, each setback with a deeper breath. He never struck, never shouted, never forced. His only weapon was time. Hank, watching from the rail, murmured, "That's training, all right. Not breaking, not bending. Teaching trust with a steady hand." On the 9th day of the challenge, it happened. Ethan entered with a damp cloth soaked in medicine. Midnight snorted, pawed the ground, but didn't bolt. The cowboy lowered himself slowly, crouching by the scarred shoulder, his voice almost a whisper. "I know it hurts," he said, "but let me carry some of that pain for you." The stallion trembled, muscles twitching under the skin. Ethan reached out, slow, deliberate. His hand pressed lightly against the scar. Midnight jerked once, head tossing, but then he stilled. His breath came rough, but he didn't strike. For the first time, a human hand lay upon his wound, without violence. Ethan dabbed the cloth gently, the smell of herbs rising into the air. Midnight quivered, but remained, rooted eyes fixed on the man beside him. Outside the pen, silence spread like wildfire. The townsfolk, usually quick to laugh, now stood frozen. No whip, no rope, just a boy's touch and a horse's trust. Collins shook his head, astonished. Damn, he's letting him. Abigail's eyes shone. She whispered almost to herself, he's teaching us not just the horse. The stories swept through Dust Valley by nightfall. The devil horse, let him touch it, someone exclaimed in the saloon. Not just touch, another corrected. He cleaned the wound, bandaged it right there in front of us. For some, it was a miracle. For others, an insult, the end of their cruel entertainment. From her porch, Clara Grayson watched as lanterns bobbed around the pen, the glow reflecting on Ethan's calm figure. She thought of her husband, who ruled with fists and pride, and of this cowboy who ruled nothing but his own patience. The contrast pierced her deeply. Abigail, meanwhile, carried a quiet flame of admiration that words couldn't contain. Grayson himself, however, seethed. The veins at his temple bulged when word reached him. That wretch makes me a fool in front of my own people. My horse obeys him more than me. His fury was a storm building on the horizon. That evening, after the crowd dispersed, Ethan stepped out of the pen. Midnight followed him with his eyes, ears flicking forward. He didn't rear, didn't shriek, only let out a low, rumbling nicker that sounded almost like a farewell. Ethan turned, smiling faintly. "Good boy. We've started, haven't we, healing?" Together, the morning light poured over Dust Valley like honey, softening the hard edges of the ranch and turning the dust into gold. Ethan rose before dawn, as he had every day since the challenge began, his hat pulled low, his boots crunching in the dirt as he walked toward the pen. Midnight stood waiting ears, flicking muscles taut, but no longer explosive with rage. Something between them had changed since the night Ethan first laid his hand on the scarred shoulder. Now came the next trial. Ethan carried a bundle under one arm, an old saddle cracked and weathered from years of use, and a faded blanket folded neatly. The stallion noticed immediately. His ears pinned back, his nostrils flared. Ethan stopped well short of the fence, letting the horse take in the strange shapes. "This isn't for herding," Ethan murmured. He lifted the saddle, let the sun strike the worn leather, then set it down just inside the fence, where Midnight could smell it. The stallion approached warily, neck arched, sniffing the air with suspicion. He snorted, pawed the ground, but did not retreat. That was enough for the first day. The following morning, Ethan hung the saddle on the rail, letting it dangle in plain sight, while he went about the routine, refilling the water trough, replacing the hay, humming softly through his teeth. Midnight's eyes flicked again and again toward the saddle ears twitching, but he did not spook. On the third day, Ethan unfolded the blanket. He ran it over his own arm, shook it in the breeze, then slowly raised it toward Midnight's shoulder. The horse shuddered, shifted back 2 paces, but stayed inside the pen. Ethan lowered the blanket at once, stepping away, giving space. And so it went every day, another attempt, another small test. A lift, a touch, a release. By the end of the week, Midnight was allowing the cloth to rest briefly across his back. His sides quivered, his eyes rolled white, but he did not explode. Each time, Ethan removed the blanket, gently praising him in a low voice. "Good boy. That's enough for today." The stallion's resistance did not vanish overnight. But something subtle was happening, something that every careful eye in the valley began to notice. The wild animal, once feared as a demon, now lingered under Ethan's hand, not yet tame, but no longer lost to fury. By the 10th day, word had spread beyond the ranch. At the saloon, men leaned over their cards, whispering, "They say the Black Devil lets him put a blanket on its back." In the marketplace, women haggling over sacks of flour paused to mutter, "Maybe it's true. Maybe the boy's got a gift." But just as many scoffed. "Nonsense," one ranch hand spat, slamming his mug on the table. "The horse is tired, that's all. Sick from the scar. It ain't trust, it's weakness." Yet others were beginning to believe. A group of children started running out to the fence each evening to watch, eyes wide as saucers, whispering, as though they were witnessing a legend unfold. To them, Ethan had become more than a cowboy. He was a story waiting to be told. One morning at the town square, the tension finally cracked. Ethan's name was on everyone's lips, some mocking, some awed. A group of men near the well laughed loud enough for half the market to hear. That drifter's a fool. You'll see he'll get himself trampled before the fortnight's done. Then we'll bury him and his blanket together. A quiet voice cut through the noise. Perhaps Clara Grayson said, stepping forward with her basket of vegetables balanced on her hip this time, justice belongs to the one you call a fool. And if so, maybe Dust Valley needs to change as much as that horse. The market froze. Clara, who so rarely spoke in public, who lived in the long shadow of her husband's name, had spoken against him in broad daylight. The words spread from lip to lip faster than wildfire. By dusk, the whole valley knew that Clara Grayson had openly challenged the way of things. Abigail, hearing the news, pressed a hand against her chest to hide her smile. For the first time, her mother had broken her silence, and the act filled her with pride and hope for Ethan. Hank, when he heard of it, merely puffed his pipe and muttered, "Took long enough for someone to say what we've all been thinking." But to Richard Grayson himself, the humiliation was unbearable. The ranch master raged in his office, the heavy oak desk rattling as he slammed his fists. "A tramp," he roared. "A nothing cowboy making me a spectacle before my own people. And now my own wife speaks his name as if he were a savior." His face blanched with fury. He could not rescind the challenge. Dust Valley's pride was at stake. But to lose was unthinkable. Half his land, half his power handed over to a pauper, never. He paced the floor, eyes burning with calculation. If victory could not be won by fair means, then unfair ones would have to suffice. From the shadows of the doorway, a voice drawled. "You called for me, boss." Eduardo stepped into the lamplight, a tall, scarred man with a cruel smile and a reputation that made most of the valley shiver. Once a drifter himself, he had long since bound his loyalty to Grayson in exchange for steady pay and the pleasure of violence. Grayson didn't waste words. That cowboy cannot succeed. Do whatever you must to make sure of it. Quietly. Eduardo's grin spread slow and sharp. Accidents happen around horses, don't they? One slip, one kick. Nobody blames the beast. Grayson leaned back, his anger coiling into a cold satisfaction. See to it, but leave no trace. If anyone asks, Midnight's temper was always the killer. Eduardo tipped his hat. Consider it done. The room darkened with the weight of conspiracy. Meanwhile, Ethan labored unoblivious to the storm gathering against him. That afternoon, he led Midnight to the center of the pen with the blanket folded in his hands. His movements were patient, unhurried, each step measured like a prayer. The stallion eyed him warily, but his hooves did not strike the ground. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured. He lifted the blanket, let it brush against Midnight's side, then slid it across the broad back. For the first time, he did not remove it right away. He stepped back, giving the horse space, watching the ripple of muscles tense and tremble beneath the cloth. Midnight blew a hard breath, stomped once but did not bolt. The crowd erupted, applause, cheers, whistles. Some laughed in sheer disbelief. Others cried out as if they themselves had won. "He's doing it," someone shouted. "The boy's going to ride." Ethan smiled faintly, tipping his hat, but in his heart he knew this was only the beginning. Trust was fragile, like a flame in the wind, bright, hopeful, but all too easy to snuff out. And beyond the fence, unseen by most, Eduardo leaned against a post in the shadows. His lips curled into a predatory smirk. "Enjoy it while you can, cowboy," he whispered. Tomorrow the story changes. The valley slept beneath a pale silver moon. The cicadas had gone quiet, the air brittle with the kind of silence that made every sound dangerous. From the shadows near the barn, Eduardo crept forward. His boots barely touched the ground, his breath controlled to nothing more than a whisper. In his hand glinted a knife, no longer than his palm, sharp enough to slice leather. He crouched by the gate of Midnight's pen. The stallion stirred ears, flicking nostrils, flaring as if sensing the presence of something foul. Eduardo muttered under his breath, "Easy, beast. Tonight, you'll be gone." The blade bit into the rope fibers, snapping with faint, sharp sounds. Eduardo worked quickly, sweat dripping down his temple. The plan was simple. Midnight would be set loose into the darkness. A wild horse disappearing into the desert was no crime. And without the horse, Ethan's challenge would collapse. No horse meant no proof of skill. No proof meant no land. A runaway in the night, Eduardo smirked. No one will blame me. The cowboy loses everything and Grayson stays untouchable. He cut deeper into the last strand, but Eduardo wasn't alone. Hank Miller had risen from his bunk earlier, restless. Something in the night air had gnawed at his instincts. He strapped on his boots, slid his old revolver into its holster, and walked the perimeter. The years hadn't dulled his senses. As he neared the barn, a glimmer of moonlight caught his eye, a flash of metal where there should be none. "Damn it," Hank hissed. He moved closer, quiet as the hunter he once was, until the outline of a man bent low at the pen became clear. The unmistakable hunch of shoulders, the knife moving deliberately. Eduardo. Hank's voice split the night like thunder. "Drop it, Eduardo!" The henchman jerked up, knife still in hand, eyes wild. "What the don't move?" Hank barked, revolver already drawn, leveled at his chest. Eduardo's first instinct was to run. He spun toward the open yard, but Hank cut him off with a single-step revolver, unwavering. The two men froze under the moon. Midnight stamped and tossed his head, unsettled by the sudden violence. Hank's voice was iron. "Step away from that gate." Eduardo sneered. "Old man, you wouldn't shoot." "Try me," Hank snapped. "You've already cut halfway through that rope. Another second and the horse would have bolted. That's sabotage. That's cowardice." Eduardo's jaw worked, his confidence cracking under Hank's fury. The older man stepped closer, steel in his eyes. "You weren't just endangering Ethan." Hank growled. "You were condemning that horse too. Do you know what happens when a wounded animal gets turned loose in the dark? Coyotes finish what your knife started? That's not cowboy work. That's filth." Eduardo faltered, knife trembling in his grip. For the first time, his bravado seemed thin. The sound of running feet broke the standoff. A pair of ranch hands drawn by the shouting appeared with lanterns in hand. Their lights spilled across the scene. Eduardo cornered Hank's gun, trained on him, the rope at the gate hanging ragged and half-severed. "God almighty," one man breathed. He was letting the stallion out. Hank's gaze never wavered. "Say it, Eduardo. Tell them what you were doing." The henchman's sneer cracked into a grimace. I had no choice." "Whose orders?" Hank pressed, his voice booming now that witnesses had gathered. Eduardo said nothing, but his eyes betrayed him, darting once, just once, toward the grand house where Richard Grayson slept. The ranch hands followed that glance, and understanding dawned across their faces. "You bastard," one hissed. "You were working for him." "Enough," Eduardo spat, still trying to sound defiant. But the lantern light had stripped away his shadows, leaving him bare. His knife clattered to the dirt as Hank pressed forward, revolver steady. "Drop it all," Hank ordered. And Eduardo, cornered, obeyed. By dawn, the story had reached every corner of Dust Valley. At the saloon, men leaned back in their chairs, voices low but sharp. Eduardo tried to set the beast loose. Hank caught him red-handed. On the main street, women paused mid-chatter, shaking their heads in disbelief. If Grayson really ordered it. What kind of man cheats his own bet? By noon, the gossip had turned into something heavier, a collective judgment. "He's not just proud anymore," a cowboy muttered over his whiskey. "He's rotten. A man who has to stoop to tricks has already lost." Even those once loyal to Grayson began to keep their distance. His power, built on fear and respect, now reeked of desperation. Clara Grayson heard every whisper as she passed through the market. She kept her eyes down her lips, pressed tight. But inside, a fire hardened. Her silence was no longer submission, it was resolve. Through all the turmoil, Ethan said nothing. While the town erupted in rumors, he walked each morning to the pen as though nothing had happened. He brought fresh water, laid clean hay, and checked the bandages on Midnight's shoulder. His hands worked steady, his voice calm. When onlookers pressed for his opinion, he merely tipped his hat and said, "The horse isn't finished." And neither am I. Some expected anger, others expected boasts. Instead, they got humility, and it stirred more respect than any speech could have. One evening, with half the town gathered at the fence, Ethan lifted the bridle in plain sight. He let Midnight sniff the leather, brushing it against the stallion's muzzle. The horse snorted, pulled back a fraction, but didn't lunge or strike. A murmur rippled through the crowd. For all Grayson's schemes, progress continued. The cowboy and the black horse were moving forward one small step at a time. And so the valley witnessed a stark contrast. On one side stood Grayson, the wealthy rancher, exposed as a man who relied on deceit when strength no longer served him. His name, once a pillar, now soured on people's tongues. On the other stood Ethan, the nobody, the drifter who had walked into town with nothing but a promise and his hands. He said little, yet every act spoke louder than words. His patience, his silence, his steady care for a wounded animal had become his testimony. The morning sun rose over Dust Valley like a fiery coin spilling gold across the dry hills. Long before the rodeo horns blew, the town was already awake. Word had spread fast today. The poor cowboy would attempt the impossible ride, Midnight, the black stallion no one else could tame. They came in droves. Families with children perched on their shoulders, ranch hands smelling of sweat, and leather traders from neighboring towns, even drifters hoping to witness a story worth retelling. The grandstands filled until not a seat was left, forcing others to crowd along the fences. Vendors hawked roasted corn and whiskey, their voices drowned beneath the hum of restless anticipation. Some whispered with hope. Maybe the boy could do it. Maybe patience could beat power. Others leaned forward, only to see failure, eager to laugh at the fool who dared dream so high. The rodeo ground itself seemed to vibrate with tension. It wasn't just an exhibition, it was a trial, a judgment. Today would decide who held truth in Dust Valley, the proud rancher with all his wealth, or the cowboy with nothing but his faith in a broken horse. The horn sounded sharp and brassy. The heavy gate creaked open. Ethan appeared, walking slowly, his boots kicking dust as he led Midnight into the arena. The stallion's muscles twitched beneath his black coat, his ears flicking back and forth. He didn't rear, didn't lunge. He only trembled, a faint shiver running through his frame, as though he knew the weight of every eye upon him. The crowd buzzed. "Look at that. He's calm," someone muttered. "That can't be right. That's the devil horse." "Too calm," another whispered. "Something's changed." Ethan's hand never left the reins, but more importantly, it never left Midnight's mane either. He stroked softly, murmuring words, too quiet for anyone else to hear. His posture was easy, unforced, as though the two shared a secret line of trust, invisible to all others. On the stands, Abigail leaned forward, hands clutched against her chest, her eyes shining. Her mother, Clara, pressed her lips together, holding her breath at the sight. High above them, Richard Grayson sat rigid, his expression carved from stone. Only the whiteness of his knuckles gripping the arm of his chair betrayed him. At the center of the arena, Ethan paused. He turned to a handler waiting at the gate and nodded. The man brought forward a worn saddle, its leather faded by years of use. Ethan held it out for Midnight to sniff. The stallion huffed warm air bursting from his nostrils, but he didn't flinch. Ethan whispered, "It's just another step, partner." Slowly, deliberately, he lifted the saddle and set it across Midnight's back. The world seemed to stop. No one breathed. The horse quivered, but remained in place, hooves steady on the dirt. Ethan looped the cinch strap beneath and fastened it carefully, his hands sure but gentle, never rushing. He moved like water around the animal, flowing patient. A gasp rolled through the crowd. No way. By God, he's letting it happen. Up in the stands, Hank Miller allowed himself a proud nod. "That's what patience buys," he murmured. "Not the whip, not the spur. Patience." Now came the heart of it. Ethan placed his boot into the stirrup. He drew in a steady breath, then pulled himself upward, settling into the saddle with the weight of the entire valley pressing down on him. The crowd went utterly silent. Not even the vendors dared shout. Midnight shook once, stamping his hooves into the dirt, muscles rippling with nervous tension. His ears flicked back, then forward, his chest heaving. But he didn't buck. Ethan leaned low, resting a hand against the stallion's neck. His voice was a low promise. "I'm here. I won't hurt you." Seconds dragged like lifetimes. Then Midnight exhaled. A deep, long breath that carried his fear out with the dust. He stood still, trembling but firm beneath Ethan's weight. The silence broke in a great collective sigh of relief. Then Ethan gave the gentlest squeeze with his heels. Midnight launched forward, black mane whipping in the wind as he surged into a gallop. The crowd erupted into shouts, cheers, gasps. The stallion thundered around the arena, his strides powerful and clean, his head tossing high with pride. No bucking, no rage, only motion, smooth and glorious. Dust spiraled behind him in golden clouds. Children screamed with delight. Men bellowed their approval, women clapped until their palms stung. Each lap grew faster, stronger, as though Midnight himself had remembered what freedom felt like. And atop him, Ethan sat straight and steady, moving as one with the horse. His body rose and fell in perfect rhythm, not forcing, not dominating, only guiding, only trusting. "This ain't training one old ranch hand," muttered, eyes wide. "This is partnership." By the third lap, the grandstands were on their feet, their cheers a thunder louder than the hooves. Some wept, openly overwhelmed by the sight of a miracle made flesh. At last, Ethan pulled gently on the reins, and Midnight slowed to a canter, then a trot, then a proud stamping halt at the center of the ring. The arena shook with the roar of the crowd. Hank pounded his hand against the rail, laughing with tears in his eyes. He did it. The boy damn well did it. Abigail broke from the stands, racing down the steps until she reached the edge of the arena. Her voice cut through the chaos, trembling with joy. "You did it, Ethan. You won." Clara's lips moved in a whisper, carried away by the cheers. "Yes. Justice at last belongs to the one despised." Then, as the jubilation swelled, silence rippled in one direction, the crowd's eyes turning almost in unison to the figure seated high above. Richard Grayson sat stiff, his face scarlet beneath his hat brim. He opened his mouth once, but no words came. His jaw clenched, his throat worked, but the proof was undeniable. Before the entire town, Ethan had tamed Midnight. A rancher in the front row shouted up at him, voice sharp as a whip. "It was your challenge, Grayson, we all heard it. Are you a man of your word or just a coward hiding behind his name?" Another chimed in. He rode the stallion, You promised half the ranch." The voices multiplied, rising like a storm. Grayson's hands trembled against the chair arms. His tongue searched for excuses, but none could stand against what hundreds had seen with their own eyes. All at once his power cracked. Where once Dust Valley Ranch had symbolized wealth and dominance, now it stood as a monument to arrogance toppled. The land would pass not by theft, not by trickery, but by the rightful victory of a cowboy too poor to buy his own horse, yet rich enough in patience and faith to win it all. The roar of the crowd still echoed when a different sound cut through the firm clearing of a throat. An older man in a gray suit, his hair silver, his boots polished but scuffed at the heel, stepped into the center of the arena. It was Mr. Howard, the town's longest-serving attorney, respected even by men who hated lawyers. In one hand, he carried a worn leather folder. In the other, a rolled parchment. The stands hushed. If midnight's run had been the miracle, then this man was the judge to declare its meaning. Howard's voice rang steady and deliberate. "People of Dust Valley, before you lies not just a feat of horsemanship, but a matter of law." He held up the parchment. "I carry here the written bylaws of this valley old as the first fences clear as the land we stand on. And I also hold testimony signed by 7 witnesses of a wager spoken openly by Richard Grayson himself." Murmurs rippled. Heads turned toward Grayson. Howard's gaze sharpened. The wager was this: if Ethan Cole could approach saddle and ride midnight, then half of Dust Valley Ranch would belong to him. Those words were spoken in public before witnesses, as binding as any contract. A cheer thundered from the crowd. Men slapped their hats against their thighs. Women clapped with tears in their eyes. Grayson surged to his feet, sweat beading on his brow. "It was jest," he barked, his voice cracking. "A joke among men, nothing more." Howard didn't blink. "In this town, sir, there is no such thing as a binding jest. The law does not laugh. The people here are witnesses. By rule and by honor, the land is his." The cheers swelled again, louder, rolling like thunder across the arena. Before the applause had died, another voice rose. Clara Grayson stepped forward. Her dress fluttered in the dry breeze, her chin held higher than anyone had ever seen. "I will speak," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "If the law demands this ranch be shared, then let it be so. Dust Valley has suffered enough under broken promises. This time we will keep our word." Gasps broke out. Clara, who had endured her husband's shadow in silence for decades, now stood openly against him. Beside her, Abigail darted down from the stands, her boots striking the dirt. She reached Ethan, laid a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than tame a horse," she said fiercely. "You've given us back our faith." The crowd erupted again this time, chanting Ethan's name. "Ethan, Ethan, Ethan." Grayson's eyes flared dark with humiliation as his wife and daughter stood aligned with the very cowboy he had scorned. The tide turned fast. Men who had once toasted Grayson in the saloon now shouted against him. "You've no honor left," Grayson, one bellowed. Ranch hands who had ridden his cattle drives muttered among themselves, then spoke aloud. "If he won't keep his word, we'll quit the ranch come morning." Merchants folded their arms, voices stern. "This town won't trade with a man who breaks covenant." Not anymore. The arena filled with condemnation, sharper than any noose. Grayson, who once held the valley in his fist, stood now as its pariah. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was iron, his presence the proof of everything they shouted. Grayson snapped. "Enough!" His roar cracked the air. He slammed a fist against the wooden rail so hard it splintered. "This is my land, mine by sweat, mine by blood. No beggar, no drifter, no horse whisperer will steal it from me." His face blazed red. His chest heaved. He turned as though daring someone to defy him. Yet the eyes staring back were not afraid. Even Eduardo, his loyal knife hand, dropped his gaze to the dirt. From the crowd, a clear voice rang out. "You challenged him. He won. That's justice, Grayson. Live with it." The words cut deeper than any blade. For the first time, Richard Grayson felt the ground shift beneath him, not by quake, but by rejection. Mr. Howard stepped forward once more, paper in hand. "By witness of this town, by record of your own words, I declare half of Dust Valley Ranch belongs to Ethan Cole." The crowd rose in unison, clapping, stomping, cheering, as though judgment itself had spoken. Grayson's shoulders sagged, his face drained of color. The paper was thrust into his hands, and with it a pen. His fingers trembled. He scrawled his name across the page, each stroke jagged, broken. When it was done, he flung the pen down its clatter, lost in the roar of the crowd. Then he turned his boots, dragging through the dust, his figure shrinking as he walked away. Through the same gates that once opened only for his command. People jeered, whistled, muttered. Not one voice called him back. In the center of the arena, the mood was different. Hope surged like rain after drought. "Dust Valley Ranch will live again," someone shouted. "Ethan Cole will bring fairness," another cried. Hank Miller strode forward, gripping Ethan's hand in a calloused shake. "From today, this place ain't just yours, boy. It's the hope of every man and woman who ever dreamed of justice here." Ethan nodded, his lips pressed tight. Beside him, Abigail smiled through tears, her gaze never leaving him. Clara stood silent, but her small nod said more than words ever could. And so it ended. Grayson's figure dwindled, swallowed by the crowd's disdain, a man stripped of fear, power, and legacy. His name, once spoken with awe, now lingered only as a warning. It was more than the collapse of one man. It was the end of an era. The reign of arrogance, and the beginning of something new. Dust Valley at last belonged not to wealth or pride, but to truth. Ethan Cole, the cowboy who only weeks before had been the butt of every cruel laugh, now stood at the gates of his inheritance. Half of Dust Valley Ranch stretched before him, acres of worn pasture, broken fences, and a house that needed mending. It was not wealth, not yet. But it was a beginning, and Ethan knew it needed a new name. 2 mornings after the judgment, he gathered a few boards of weathered pine and spent the day carving with his pocket knife. When at last he raised the finish sign on 2 sturdy posts at the front gate, the letters caught the sun in bold strokes. Midnight Training Ranch, where trust begins with patience. The people of Dust Valley stopped to stare. Some shook their heads in disbelief, whispering how the poor cowboy had risen higher than they thought possible. Others smiled with quiet pride, as though his victory somehow belonged to them too. When asked, Ethan only shrugged. "This isn't my victory," he said, brushing Midnight's dark mane as the stallion grazed behind him. "It belongs to him. Without Midnight, I'd still be nobody." The stallion lifted his head as if he understood, and the townsfolk nodded. Word of the new ranch spread quickly. But Ethan had no intention of turning it into a monument to himself. Instead, he saw it as a chance to open doors that had long been closed. At the saloon one evening, he stood on the small stage and cleared his throat. The room quieted, curious. "I know what it feels like," he began, his voice steady but humble. "To dream of riding, of working with horses, and to be told you'll never belong. I was that boy. I was laughed at, and I nearly believed them. Nearly." He paused, his hand resting lightly on the brim of his hat. "But I learned something with Midnight, that trust, patience, and respect are stronger than fear. So I'm opening Midnight Training Ranch to anyone who wants to learn. Doesn't matter if you're poor, doesn't matter if you've never touched a saddle. If you want a chance, you'll find it here." There was silence for a moment, then the saloon erupted in cheers. The following week, young men and women came trudging up the dusty road, farmhands with calloused palms, orphans with nothing but ragged clothes, even a few who had once worked under Grayson's iron hand. They carried hope in their eyes and little else. At the ranch, Ethan greeted them one by one. Here, he told them, we don't strike horses. We don't scare them into submission. We listen, we wait, we earn their trust, the same way we'll earn each other's. And so Dust Valley saw the birth of the first school of horsemanship built not on dominance, but on patience. Locals called it, half joking, half serious, the Ranch of Hope. Hank Miller was the first to stand beside Ethan. The old cowboy, whose back was bent but whose spirit was unbroken, took to the role of mentor as naturally as a man takes to breathing. He gathered the students under the cottonwoods and showed them how to read a horse's ears, how to notice the twitch of a tail or the stiffening of muscles. He explained the quiet language hidden in every gesture. "The trick ain't to make the horse fear you, Hank," told them, his voice carrying the gravel of years. "It's to make him believe in you. Once he does, he'll go through fire if you ask." The students listened as if to scripture. To them, Hank was more than a teacher. He was living proof that wisdom mattered more than wealth. And to Hank, the ranch was more than land. It was his second chance, a place where all the lessons of his long-weathered life could finally bear fruit. Not long after Dr. Collins rode out to the ranch, a satchel of supplies bouncing against his saddle. He had been the first to notice Midnight's old injury, and Ethan asked him to stay involved. Collins agreed gladly. He began teaching the students the basics of animal care, how to clean a wound, how to wrap a bandage, how to spot lameness before it grew worse. He set up a small shed as a makeshift clinic and spent hours each week training hands that had never before touched a stethoscope. This place, Collins told the youngsters one afternoon, isn't just for training horses. It's for healing horses and people both. You'll learn that patience in medicine is the same as patience in riding. The youths nodded, some with wide-eyed awe, others with solemn gratitude. For many, it was the first education they'd ever received. Abigail, too, found her place. Leaving her father's house had been a decision that tore her heart, but she knew where she belonged now. At Ethan's side, she became the ranch's steady hand and the one who kept the ledgers balanced, organized the work, and made sure each new student had food and a bed. But she did more than manage accounts. In the evenings, she gathered the orphans around the kitchen table and taught them their letters. She believed a mind deserved as much care as a horse. "No one should be left illiterate in this valley," she said quietly. "If we're building trust, it must be in people too." Ethan watched her from the doorway, some nights her face lit by lamplight, her hair falling loose as she bent over a slate with a child. The respect between them deepened, no longer just gratitude, but a bond rooted in the same vision that Dust Valley could change. And at the heart of it all stood Midnight. The seasons turned, and with each passing year, Midnight carried the weight of time as gracefully as he once carried the fire of rebellion. The stallion who had once been feared and cursed across Dust Valley now walked the fields as a legend in flesh. Young riders would watch him graze or lift his head at the call of Ethan's whistle. And to them, he was more than a horse. He was a silent teacher, the wordless mentor who showed what trust looked like without a single command. But time spares no creature, not even legends. Midnight's once powerful stride slowed the muscles that had once rippled with strength softened, and his eyes, though still gentle, grew clouded with age. Yet even in decline, he held himself proudly, ears alert, head high. as if reminding everyone that dignity need not fade with strength. Then came the evening no one would ever forget. The sun hung low, painting the sky in bands of crimson and gold. Midnight climbed the hill above the ranch, the same hill where he had so often stood, as if surveying all that he had helped build. His coat shimmered faintly in the dying light. He raised his head, drew in a final deep breath, and released a long, ringing whinny that rolled across the valley like a farewell trumpet. Ranch hands dropped their tools. Students training in the yard looked up frozen. Even Ethan, working by the stable, stopped and turned his face toward the sound. On the hill, Midnight lowered himself slowly, knees folding, body easing into the grass. His breath came shorter, softer. Then with a final sigh, he stilled. Silence blanketed the ranch. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Abigail pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming. Hank removed his hat and held it against his chest. Ethan climbed the hill, alone knelt by the stallion's side and rested his weathered hand against the cooling coat. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough. "You carried me farther than I ever dreamed." That night, Dust Valley grieved. The ranch was hushed, the town subdued. Midnight, the beast who had once been scorned, who had become the heartbeat of a community, was gone. In the weeks that followed, grief gave way to determination. Midnight's story could not end with his death. His life had reshaped not only Ethan's fate, but the identity of Dust Valley itself. His legacy deserved a monument. Ethan gathered Hank, Abigail, Dr. Collins, and the students of the ranch. Together, they hauled stone up the hill, where the stallion had taken his last breath. It was grueling work under the summer sun, but no one complained. They shaped a tall slab of granite, polished and strong, set firmly into the earth. When the work was done, Ethan took a chisel and carved the words himself, every letter cut, with the patience Midnight had taught him. Midnight, the horse who changed the fate of a cowboy and the town of Dust Valley. On the day of the unveiling, the entire town gathered. Old men leaned on canes. Mothers carried their children. Cowboys stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants and ranch hands. Together they climbed the hill, silent but united. At the top, candles flickered in the dusk. Prairie flowers were laid at the base of the stone. Someone began to sing a low hymn, and others joined their voices, weaving into the wind. Hardened men who had once laughed at Ethan's dream wiped tears from their eyes. If not for that horse, one townsman said, his voice thick, Dust Valley wouldn't be what it is today. From then on, the hill became a hallowed ground. Every summer, the people of the valley held a remembrance, climbing the slope to honor Midnight's spirit. New students touched the stone as a rite of passage. Midnight had become more than a memory. He was a legend carried in the collective heart of Dust Valley. The passing of Midnight did not weaken the ranch. On the contrary, it grew stronger like roots, spreading deeper after a storm. Ethan threw himself into building upon what Midnight had begun. New barn rose white and sturdy against the green hills. A covered arena was built for practice during rain or heat. A classroom opened where veterinary basics were taught alongside lessons in horsemanship and the philosophy of patience. Word spread across the region. Midnight Training Ranch was no longer just a ranch, it was an academy. Young men and women came from counties far beyond, many poor, some broken, all seeking the chance to learn. Horses once considered lost causes were brought here, and under the careful hands of Ethan's students, they transformed into steady companions. Newspapers carried stories, a place where the wild becomes trust. Travelers wrote of a town reborn through kindness and discipline. Dust Valley, once just another forgotten settlement, became a name known across the West. Ethan himself aged, But like Midnight, he carried his years with pride. His once dark hair was streaked with silver now, his skin weathered by sun and wind. Yet when he mounted a horse, his back was still straight, his presence commanding. The people called him the Cowboy of justice and trust. But Ethan never let the title rest on his shoulders. He remembered the boy he had been, the poor hand, mocked by everyone, the dreamer who had dared to step into a stall with nothing but patience. Whenever a student faltered, overwhelmed by fear or frustration, Ethan would sit them down and tell the story. I once walked into a stall that held the fiercest horse dust Valley had ever known. Folks said he'd kill me if I came close, but I didn't carry a whip. I carried a flute. I didn't shout, I listened. And little by little he let me close. He would smile, then the lines of his face softening. That day changed everything. And if patience could tame that horse, then patience can carry you through whatever stands in your way. Students listened in rapt silence. For them, Ethan wasn't just a teacher, but living proof that strength wasn't found in force, but in humility and perseverance. Generations carried his words like scripture, repeating them to their own children. Evenings on the ranch carried their own kind of poetry. When the day's work was done, Ethan often climbed the hill where the monument stood. He would sit in the grass, flute in hand, and let a soft melody drift into the valley. It was the same tune that once calmed Midnight in his fury. The notes blended with the rhythms of life below, the thud of hooves in the paddock, the laughter of students around the fire, the low murmur of the wind moving through the tall grass. It was not a song of sorrow, but of remembrance, an acknowledgement that Midnight was gone, yet still present in every hoofbeat, every voice raised in laughter, every act of patience shown at the ranch. Ethan would lower the flute, look out across the fields and whisper, "You changed me, old friend, and you changed this town. Your spirit rides with us still, Dust Valley itself transformed." Once a place marked by dust and decline, it became known across the West as the land of patience, justice, and trust. Travelers stopped not just to see the monument, but to learn the story. Students who trained at the ranch carried its teachings far and wide, spreading its reputation. Midnight Stone stood tall over it all, a sentinel watching from the hill. The ranch flourished, the town thrived, and the legend of one scarred stallion and one stubborn cowboy grew larger than either could have imagined. Ethan knew his own days would eventually dwindle as Midnight's had. But he felt no fear. The ranch was not his alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who carried forward its spirit. It lived in every student who saddled a horse with patience, every child Abigail taught to read, every colt that learned to trust a gentle hand. The story had begun with a challenge, and a horse no one believed in. Now it lived on as a legacy strong enough to outlast anyone's life. And though the tale was drawing to its quiet close, Ethan knew in his heart the heritage of Midnight would never end.